Welcome to Renegade Inc., the talk show that allows us to think differently. In Europe during the Middle Ages, feudalism was the social order of the day. Society was structured between landowners and the landless. The serfs had to provide their labour in exchange for the use of some of the lord's land and a bit of protection. Astonishingly, in the UK today, that social order is again on the rise. Leasehold homeowners are at the mercy of a new class of rent seeker who, far from offering any protection, actively exploit them in their own homes. Over 1 in 5 privately owned houses in the UK is leasehold, but often developers and their recommended conveyancing solicitors have been short on detail when selling these properties. This has resulted in an unsustainable ground rent that ratchets up year on year, leaving leaseholders with a massive bill and often an unsaleable property. Here in the studio to explain the sleight of hand behind this growing crisis are the founder of the National Leasehold Campaign, Kendrick, and from the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, Sebastian O'Kelly. Thank you both for coming by. Now, to have set up these organisations, there's obviously a problem afoot. Katie, if you look at the landscape of this crisis, this scandal, give us an overview from your point of view of what's happening.
I bought a leasehold property in 2014 and fully intended to buy the freehold after 2 years when I was legally entitled to do so. But before that point, they sold the freehold on. And I didn't realise what the impact of the onward sale of my freehold would be to me. My house was built by Bellway. They sold the freehold on without my knowledge because the right of first refusal does not apply to houses, only flats. So they wrote to me after they'd sold my freehold on saying, this is your new freeholder and these will be the people that will be collecting your ground rent and nothing else will change. Alarm bells didn't really start ringing. They sold it onto a company called Adriatic Land for GR1 Limited.
And how much do you know about that company?
I know that it's linked to the David Cameron family, William Astor. My ground rent's collected by a company called Homeground. You can't ring Homeground. There's no phone number for them. Don't take incoming calls. The only way I can correspond with them is via email. If you want to ask them any form of question, it's £108.
Well, hang on. I mean, because people think that an expensive landline, for instance, the universal credit thing with 55p a minute is bad. If you also ask a question...
If you want to ask if you need permission to do certain things, you need to pay £108.
And when you say permission to do certain things, what does that mean?
For example, if I wanted to build a small conservatory, which didn't need planning permission, so quite very small, Bellway would have wanted £300 permission fee. But when they sold the freehold on to the third party, the same permission costs £2,600. So not only was my ground rent sold on, it was the X factor, and it's the X factor that people don't realise. I pay £150 a year ground rent. To me, that is not my personal problem. Mine is the X factor, which I didn't realise.
What is the X factor?
Is the permission fees that are associated with your house. If you want to put your house up for sale, you have to pay a permission fee. Some people's leases, if you want to change your carpets to wooden floors, there's a permission fee. If you want to change mortgage providers, so every 2 years when your mortgage is up, you've got to pay a permission fee to do so. And these are fees which, was not identified upon sale when I bought the house.
This is a racket.
It's a complete racket. It's unique to England and Wales. We sell leasehold properties. Leasehold just means tenancy. It's usually used for flats, but developers have recognised what a successful racket this is and have spread it to houses and have now increasingly built leasehold houses up and down the country.
My name's Andrea Millward. I live in Prescott, near Liverpool, with my husband Roy and our 2 children, Sienna and Isaac.
My name's Lisa Chappell and I'm an occupational therapist working in the NHS.
Buying our first home was really exciting. We had a little 1-year-old at the time, so she was loving having our own little house. And we bought it on the government's first buy scheme, and then we funded the rest ourselves through the mortgage.
It was only after we put the money down to reserve the plot, we were then told that the property was leasehold, but we were assured that it's standard practice. We asked how much the ground rent would be, and we were told for us it was £250 and that we would have the opportunity to purchase the freehold in 2 years' time.
I got a knock on the door from one of the neighbours saying, did you know that your ground rent was due to double? So I went back and I checked my lease. On it I could see that Taylor Wimpey had bought it in 2008 and then it said it doubled after 10 years in January this year. We've gone from our ground rent doubling in 25 years after we've bought it to actually doubling in year 6. So we got the shock of our lives.
Like the sort of Al Capones of this world, when we're talking about racketeering, this is licensed to print cash. And you've got an absolute captive market because you've got a homeowner stuck in a home and it's legal.
Yes, I mean, we haven't had a sort of St. Valentine's Day massacre or anything like that yet in the leasehold world, but it is a racket. It's one that's gone on for hundreds of years in England and Wales. It explains why aristocratic families own the centre of London. The wealth that was created hundreds of years ago has been perpetuated because every subsequent property transaction hasn't been a property transaction of the freehold, but only of a tenancy. It's one of the advantages of the country that we have was we've had political stability and we haven't gone around killing each other. Disadvantages of that is that certain feudal laws have continued into the modern era, and leasehold is a prime example of that. Other countries simply do not have this, and other countries where English law has held sway, such as North America or Australasia, have done away with leasehold. So have Northern Ireland and Scotland, where there's only ever been a small amount of leasehold property, but it has been done away with. Well, that's what we need over here in England.
But it's raging. And we're obviously both campaigning to get it stopped. What you say that we're not killing each other, but there are absolute health downsides to this, because surely if you get a letter out of the blue saying, you know what, you thought that this was a leasehold property and you're only going to pay this nominal amount, some would say a peppercorn rent annually, but actually it's X times this, surely there's a health downside to that.
I never realised I was going to be funding somebody else's long-term investment. You know, as far as I was concerned, my home should be my own investment and nobody else's. If I had known what I know now about the whole leasehold scam, there was no way anybody would enter into that. You know, you're just so vulnerable.
When the 2-year mark came up, we were told that we couldn't buy the freehold and that we're on a 10-year doubling ground rent, which also wasn't explained to us at the point of sale. When we bought, we used an equity loan off the government to help us to purchase this house, and we got told that we had to use one of the conveyancing solicitors that was recommended by the house builder. At no point did they explain or describe that we was on a 10-year doubling ground rent.
The salesman told us that we could buy the ground for 10 times the annual ground rent. We always had the intention of buying it before the 10 years was up. Taylor Wimpey sold the land on 12 months after we moved in, so they had no intention of selling us the land that the house is sat on at all. And if we want to buy the land the house is sat on now, it's going to cost between £30,000 to £40,000. So we were missold by Taylor Wimpey, by their salesman, and then we went on to be misled by the conveyancing solicitor.
Your developer, Bellway, did they give you a recommendation about who should be doing the conveyancing?
I only bought a new build because I wanted to use the government's Help to Buy scheme. That was only applicable to new build properties.
Right, and so you used that?
I used the government's Help to Buy, yeah. You only have a 28-day window to exchange contracts when you pay your deposit, and there's an awful lot to achieve in that 28 days. So they recommended a solicitor who knew the development, knew the area, knew the Help to Buy scheme.
Who recommended it?
Bellway.
Right.
There was a sign up. I've still got the sign at home with their fees, and basically they said that it would be easier. They've got a good relationship with them. The sales lady knew the solicitor at the end of the phone. It would all go through in the timescale that they needed it to.
Right.
Hence why I just thought whatever's the easier option. So yes, I used Bellway's recommended solicitors.
Was there a moment when you were going through that transaction where they flagged up to you and they said, you know what, there is an option for Bellway to sell this leasehold in the future?
No, I had no idea. I, perhaps quite naively, thought that my freeholder would always be Bellway until I wanted to buy my freehold. They quoted between 2,000 and 4,000 to buy your freehold after 2 years. So to me, that was absolutely fine. So I didn't look at the long-term implications to what I was buying because I didn't want it to be leasehold in the first place. But
you say it's absolutely fine between £2,000 and £4,000.
Yeah.
What are the long-term implications if you continue down this trajectory?
Well, now, because my freehold's been sold on, the new freeholder quoted me initially £13,000. They have come down to £7,600. But also, within that £7,600, the permission fees to make alterations to your house remains. So even if you buy your freehold, you still have to pay a permission fee to make alterations to your house. So what is the point?
Do you see these signs as universal traits across the country, or is this specific to, for instance, the Northwest?
No, it's right the way across the country, and it's mainly with flats. The sale of new leasehold houses is relatively recent, and you see that it has increased exponentially on the land registry in recent years. Now, there is a historic legacy of leasehold houses, and there's more than 1 million of them in this country, but most of those date back to the sort of factory era. But this new wheeze of creating new leasehold houses anywhere in the country, even in counties such as Somerset or Hampshire or Essex, which have absolutely no tradition of leasehold houses whatsoever and no legacy of industrial era leasehold housing, it's purely being done to profit. and to leg over their own customers. Over the past few years, we have had a building boom fuelled by taxpayers in the form of the Help to Buy system. It has created vastly inflated share price values for the house builders. It's created enormous bonuses for the chief executives who head these companies, and the bill has come back to the taxpayer. How on earth the government thinks that this is a good idea and good use of government money in an era of austerity, it beggars belief. Frankly.
But I'm shocked. I often sit in this chair listening to to people who come in but I'm sort of speechless at this because it's a state-sponsored racket. You work as a paediatric nurse, you work for the NHS, and you hear of a chief executive at some of these businesses on just a bonus, this is excluding a salary, upwards of £100 million. Is that for a year?
Oh, no, that will be the accumulated bonus, but it's still a stratospheric bonus.
Over what sort of time period
Well,
would that
I think
be?
it's going to be over about 5 years.
5 years. So 20 mil a year. It is phenomenal. And really the cash flows that are being securitised and rinsed around the financial system that you're paying ultimately translate to that kind of figure. Is that not true?
It is true, and it's disgraceful, but it's something that has been tolerated because we have never got round to reforming and ending leasehold law. We are perpetuating this form of tenancy in selling property, which makes an entire generation of people who buy these products vulnerable. So there's a generational swindle here going on, because if you're under the age of about 35, chances are you are in a leasehold house or a leasehold flat. It can't be right that an entire generation of home buyers are excluded from the real benefits of home ownership, but remain as a long-term tenant to somebody else. Worse still, in the case of Katie, whose freeholder is this murky outfit called Adriatic Land, the ultimate beneficial owners of Adriatic Land hide their beneficial ownership behind nominee directors.
What does that mean?
It means that we don't actually know who owns it. And that applies in so much of British property. £256 billion worth of commercial and residential property are owned offshore, and we do not know who the beneficial owners are. How can a healthy democracy function with that amount of tax avoidance? If you can't come forward as the beneficial owner of a property, my view is that you should lose it.
It's a wonderful place to leave the first half. We're going to come back in the second half and talk solutions. Welcome back to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more about a form of modern British feudalism with Katie Kendrick and Sebastian O'Kelly, let's see what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up, we have a tweet from Emma Hines. Abolish leasehold. Homeowners should not be a constant stream of revenue for greedy developers and investors. Hashtag leasehold scandal. Next, we have one from Remus out NC. This just needs constant highlighting. The company we don't want, have no say over, and get threatened by are taking 56% as a fee. And that comes in at £44,280.
This does not just affect low-cost housing. We give our advice to leaseholders, rich or poor, and the more affluent leasehold disputes are extremely useful because they often do win the victories that help so many others.
Next, from balls to cancer, we need business to help us cover the £7,000 ground rent for our free holiday home. For cancer fighters, can you help us with some or all? From Denise Clark, tiny ground rents. You just try and extend your lease and you'll see the reality of what you're in. Serfdom sucks. Finally, from Mike Ball, the power of the aristocracy revisited in the current leasehold and ground rent scandal. There has been an organisation called a Giant Vampire Squid, and they have been in some way involved, Goldman Sachs. I think they've sold their shareholding, haven't they, now, in one of the businesses?
They've helped fund Rosse Life, which has a debenture on the ground rent incomes of the Chengitz Family Trust freeholds, which did, at its peak, own 1% of all the residential freeholds in the country.
How was your interest piqued in this? Because you seem so incredibly knowledgeable about it and also passionate about it.
Well, I was looking at the retirement sector, where you're looking at the most vulnerable people in society. and realising that their freeholds were owned by a highly controversial financier, ultimately owned by his so-called family trust based in the British Virgin Islands. So I just couldn't understand why a person who was really interested in high-scale city speculations would be attracted to retirement housing. The reason was, of course, because of the high rewards there. You have a sector of society who would find it difficult to use the protections which existing English leasehold law has for leaseholders.
And you started digging. You understood that a lot of this money went offshore. Did you start then see the sort of macro social aspect of this?
The most alarming feature is that obviously I was a property editor for 12 years, so I was looking at how housing was changing. And of course, London has transformed. We will see everything first here. And in London, we're producing only flats. Everything is leasehold. And it occurred to me that actually, if we're producing all these tenancies on a huge scale now, then we are going to create the kind of situations which did lead to the huge aristocratic fortunes which account for the fact that various family trusts still own the centre of central London. And I just think, one Duke of Westminster, fine. 100 Duke of Westminsters, no thank you. I think it is coming to an end now. Thanks to Katie's efforts, first thing a would-be purchaser is doing is coming to the sales office and saying, is this house for sale leasehold or freehold? And the house builders have all hit reverse and are now selling them freehold. So that's a huge
Great
achievement.
work. OK, but on our current trajectory, because no legislation has changed,
Yep.
the Leasehold Reform Act, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
It hasn't changed. Where do we end up? With 100 Duke of Westminsters?
We will end up with millions of leasehold properties, mainly flats. You will have people who own and speculate in the freeholds of those properties and who have the leaseholders more or less under their control. You have a preponderance of power for a minimum investment, really, as a freehold owner. Your freehold might be worth, £1 million. The block of flats is worth 20 million quid, yet you make all the decisions. We must not continue to perpetuate this. What it's resulting in is massive wealth erosion. People are paying for these leasehold properties, but they're paying for something that is eroding in value over time. At the same time as occupying this flat, you're paying the ground rent income. Now, that could be carved up in such a way that it's mining a considerable income out of you.
And we're doing this within the supposed confines of a property-owning democracy.
Yes, I think that was very much the optimistic view of, say, the Thatcher era of conservatism. But we have hit the brakes with that, and going back to, property ownership in this country is going down. Many people are sort of talking about build to rent and so on, and that we should actually have property ownership levels sort of on a par with Germany, which is about 50-50 rental to
Happy
ownership.
with that?
No, I think it's a bad thing. From business point of view, it's great. Business people would love it because you have a nice mobile workforce. It doesn't matter whether you can move from Hamburg to Munich very easily because you're just giving up the rental of your apartment. But it also means that you do not own an asset which grows in value. I do not think that people who live in houses in Chelsea, which go up 35% in a year, can really tell young people living in tenancies that they can't be homeowners.
And what do you say to these people who say, yeah, but hang on, we want that mobile workforce because we need to get productivity up. We want renting culture because Germany seems to have got it right, and they don't make the association between democracy and property ownership. What do you say to that?
The reason why there's so much rental property in Germany is because so much of it was new after 1945. That's the first point. The housing had to be built by the state in Germany. But I can see the attraction for businesses of a mobile workforce. But then if we were all tenants, everybody was tenants, it would be even better. Then anybody could move. But I'm afraid the people who are often delivering this sort of cruel medicine of remain a tenant aren't tenants themselves. In fact, the first question you should ask any of the senior lawyers and QCs in landlord and tenant law who make their living out of leasehold, or the estate agents, or the ground rent investors, or the surveyors is, do you live in a leasehold flat or a freehold house? And I'll bet you £20 and give you generous odds that they live in a freehold house.
I've put more than 20 quid on it.
Yeah.
What's the effect on society and community from your...
Well, it can't be a good thing for communities to have this third-party element of ownership involved in a block of flats. Everywhere else in the world, and I've owned flats in France and in Italy, we owned the entire building. Me and my neighbours, we owned it. We were responsible for it. We all owned a bit of the corridor, a bit of the roof, a bit of the drains, and we had to pay for it to maintain it. In England, that's not the case. You don't own anything. You don't own the land and you don't own the building. That belongs to a freeholder. All you own is time between some walls, and there's some vaguely written instructions in the lease And if you breach that lease, you're in serious trouble. And if you're a litigant and have to go to court, you're in a position of extreme vulnerability vis-à-vis your freeholder in any money dispute, which is why in any money dispute, our advice is almost always pay up first and then fight. If you pay up first and you lose, you're not in breach of lease and you're not vulnerable to legal costs. But if you withhold money and you go to court and you lose, the whole barrage of legal costs can come down on top of you. And I'm afraid freeholders exploit this and arm up with the most expensive lawyers conceivable in order to get back relatively small amounts of money. And I see about once a month a leaseholder car crash in the courts.
The difficulty we now have is our house developer. They've said that they will convert our leases over to a lease that's with RPI, retail index price. It's obviously going to be better than a double in ground rent, but in future years it's never capped. So it would be for 250 years that it could keep going up. Obviously that won't be in our lifetime, but if I leave this house for my daughter's inheritance, I'm potentially leaving her in financial burden and financial difficulty.
I've contacted the CEO of Taylor Wimpey. I've said, you need to help us out here. Your salesman basically lied to us to sell us this house, and we're having to sue our conveyancing solicitor, who were recommended by Taylor Wimpey. There wasn't any point in putting the house up for sale because leasehold houses just aren't selling. So we can't move, we can't have another child because we're going to have to fork out for solicitors' bills, and we need another room. So we're literally stuck.
I mean, where does all this end? We have to come to solutions.
The leasehold law seems to be reformed every 10 to 15 years. The question is, why keep on reforming it? Doesn't it tell you something that we reform it and it still doesn't work? The best thing to do is to stop creating more of it. A house builder could build a block of flats common hold. The idea was that it would be made compulsory after a certain point in time and everything thereafter would be built common hold, but that sunset clause didn't get put in it for some reason. There was some lobbying by interest groups.
Really?
And
You shocked me. Lobbying in the UK?
In the UK. And
by the property lobby?
And the house builders have chosen, on balance, not to build common hold properties. Now, why is that?
Why is that?
Because they're making...
That must be an accident, no?
I'm afraid the house builders cannot be trusted to regulate themselves and cannot be trusted really to play fair even with their own customers. I'm rather appalled by these ground rent review schemes. They seem opaque. The house builders aren't saying how many people are affected. They won't say how many people have come forward to the scheme. They're keeping everything under their own terms. I would say they have acted disgracefully. They can come clean.
The leaseholders want the developers to be held accountable for what they've done, because ultimately they are to blame. They knew full well what they were trying to missell us. You know, it's a very fine line between acting illegally and immorally, and what they've done is completely immoral, and they need to be held accountable, and hopefully we'll get them in front of the select committee, because questions need to be asked. You know, we're just working class people. We just want a fair deal. We're hoping for big change, because big change needs to happen.
It's not something that I'm going to look back on in the future as a happy time now, because it's been ruined.
It's a nightmare that's happening to us absolutely every day, and no matter what we try and do to get out of this, there's loopholes in the system which the developers have took advantage of.
My only hope is that the government steps in to force Taylor Wimpey to do what they promised in the beginning. If they don't step in to help us, then we're going to be in a position where houses are being built that aren't leasehold. And if my property goes on the market against somebody who's not leasehold, then my property still isn't going to sell. And the government has to realise that all the people across the country saying that they've been missold by not just Taylor Wimpey, but by all the developers and all the people who've been led astray when buying a house, they need to do something to help us. They can't just leave us stranded.
How do we begin to influence some kind of change?
Moving forward, completely abolish leasehold on houses. There's absolutely no purpose for it at all. Flats need to be made common hold. It's a much fairer system. But let's not forget the 1 million houses alone that are caught up with these onerous leases, or leases that we were completely missold. So we need a redress scheme. We need to go back and look, because if government are going to say they're wrong for the future, they were definitely wrong for the past.
Is there a potential class or group action against the conveyancing solicitors who oversaw this process for not being totally transparent? There
is numerous negligence claims going in against the conveyancing solicitors. But I also have to add that the Taylor Wimpey assistance scheme of 130 million that they've set aside, part of their undertaking on that is that the people that accept their offer, they have to forfeit any right to negotiate any form of legal redress or suing of negligence. They have to abandon that in order to accept their scheme. And to give up your right to fight for a negligence claim for you were missold your home, it's acknowledge that they know they've done something wrong.
What do you say to that? Give up your right, we haven't been negligent, take a bit of cash and off you go.
What I would say is that I hope that a group of them take both the house builder and the conveyancers to the courts and win hands down. But, that could be a risky course. The house builders are having their cake and eating it, really, and setting the terms of their ground rent review scheme. It hasn't been subjected to proper sort of scrutiny and criticism. It's a perfect thing for the select committee to start asking some questions of. Many of the people that bought these leasehold houses were promised the freehold by the sales staff. They can get the freeholds back off these murky and anonymous speculators who bought them and get them and sell them back to the leaseholders at the price originally paid. And that would solve the issue.
And that's not just a simple trade puff of a car salesman saying, don't worry, this runs on air. It's not that, is it? That's actually fairly misleading. In fact, very misleading.
It is. I mean, and you mentioned cars. I mean, when cars have a sort of Toyota has a problem with its, part of its engine, there's a massive recall. How come that isn't being done here? How come it's only people who get in touch with the house builders who are eligible for the review scheme? At the moment, the review scheme is totally in the hands of the people who perpetrated these abuses, and nobody has yet sort of grabbed them by the collar and held them to account.
The National Leasehold campaign is over 8,000 of us, and we are looking at if we can make a super complaint because people aren't happy. I knew nothing about leasehold till January this year. I feel like I've done a crash course in leasehold reform. I'm just a nurse working full time and, running the campaign as best as I can.
Thanks for doing it, and thanks for both coming by. That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or tweet us @Renegade Inc. We'd love to hear from you. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.